Welcome to Advanced TV Herstory. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. This is the place where we connect the dots of TV and feminism to American culture and politics. If you like what you hear, head to tvherstory.com and listen into all of our archives that are categorized to make it easier to find what you're looking for. And also, while you're there, please sign up for our newsletter. Promise I'll never sell your information. Now, on with the show. Welcome, TV Herstorians. It's April 2026, and it feels as though our whole world is upended because the Epstein files contain something that's explosive and something that will rock our world. And a lot of us want it rocked, and a lot of people are working hard to button it all down. And you might wonder what this all has to do with TV, and I'm going to tell you because this is an Advanced TV Herstory. And it's one of those moments where we connect the dots of TV and feminism to American culture and politics. And today, it's not necessarily the most happy topic in the world, but I kind of feel like I need to share it with you. So the Epstein files, we've already seen that some names have been revealed. And as a result of that revelation, we kind of are processing a whole new context for how we lived in the 80s and the 90s and the aughts. And you can see some of that on TV. But if you lived through those years, even as a youngster or as a teenager, walking the mall, you'll start to see how the dots connect. The shopping mall. Because there was a time before Victoria's Secret and Pink and Abercrombie and Fitch and Limited 2. There was a time when you got your clothes at JCPenney or Donaldson's or The Gap. And a lot of other stores that are now no longer. Because by the time that the Gen Xers were walking the mall and the millennials not far behind, the mall was selling to at least 3 generations of young people. Gen X being in their 20s and the millennials in their teens and Gen Z as babies. This was all becoming normalized. And what is this? Well, it's the teen sexuality. It's the marketing of skimpy as well as fast fashion. And it was all being driven not by the women, not by the second wave feminists who were trying to rise up as the buyers and the merchandisers. No, it was driven by the male gaze. Except in the case of Epstein and his Trump pal Les Wexner, that these stores were part of a conglomerate and they were all helmed by Les Wexner. Abercrombie, Victoria's Secret, Pink, all of them. It wasn't just the male gaze, it was the creepy old man gaze. So please, however old you were in the 90s and the aughts, let your mind wander to what that experience at an Abercrombie store was. It's a vivid detail, and you probably have it in your memory bank, even though you've probably tried to purge it. You get that heavy men's cologne smell. This is sensory. Posters of barely clad teens, and in many cases very provocative. And that was its own controversy. There were a lot of parents groups in particular who found it upsetting to see that right there in the mall. That inside you had dark interiors with this heavy smell and loud music. The clothes were so incredibly expensive that you realized as a parent you were paying as much for the branding as you were for the pair of jeans. But more importantly, that whole environment was designed, literally, for the parent, because by then we weren't necessarily paying by check. The parent hands the credit card to the kid and says, here, go in. Because honestly, as a parent to have spent more than a minute in an Abercrombie and Fitch store was sheer torture. So somebody was really doing the work that led to the acceptance of not only the Abercrombie and Fitch brand or the Victoria's Secret or whatever, but also sort of the sexual normalcy of all of that for teenagers, a time when you're at your most awkward. That consent and agency and all of that progress that had been made in the 80s and the 90s, it was starting to fly out the window, or at least it was when you were in the mall. In the mall, you were going straight for the social norms that were being dictated by people like Les Wexner and his protégés. And so in my phone, the algorithms of media and clips and everything, every once in a while, veer to the clips of all of the young women celebrities that appeared on talk shows. And I mean, talk shows have been going on. As you know, I did a couple episodes on talk shows since, for the most part, the 60s. But it was in the 80s, 90s, and aughts that Letterman and Leno and Dick Cavett, they became the icons, the legends. Johnny Carson, his patter and his rapport was a little bit different. These three, Letterman, Leno, and Dick Cavett, liked to think of themselves as men's men, I think. But the guests and the commentary and the guests' commentary about women's bodies, about women's habits was all just, the more we look at it, the more we start to put it into some context. It was not out of the norm to ask young women about their romantic life, about their body parts, and a lot of lewd and inappropriate touching. There is a lot available out there, particularly on YouTube, Instagram, wherever, that delves into this in detail, and it is, as time passes, more and more alarming. But again, these were the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And even Barbara Walters got into it. I mean, she asked some crazily insensitive questions to her women guests. And I just don't know where this all came from, or do I? So Gawker on YouTube, the Gawker YouTube channel, compiled in 2017, which is about the time of #MeToo, a bit of a highlight reel of David Letterman being his absolute worst and lascivious to women guests, such as in this first clip, Madonna.
Let's go kiss the guy in the audience. Why don't you go kiss the guy in the audience?
Why are you so obsessed with my sex life?
As we all know, I have none of my own.
The film looks like a lovely offering. And by the way, you're a lovely offering.
Oh.
When you hug me like that, I think my carrot moved.
What do you do when you want to have fun and stuff? Because you look like a girl who likes to have fun.
I like to go swimming.
Yeah, I'd like to see you sweaty.
And then there's this short clip of Sandra Bullock just trying to answer a question or tell a story.
Now, I don't know about the crew because they had to see it from literally behind.
Yeah.
So I have to apologize again publicly.
Those may be the seats you want.
Really?
And lastly, just to round out, nobody was immune from David Letterman's just sophomoric, creepy white man humor. Sharon Stone, Jennifer Aniston. You have so many Grammys, Emmys, Oscar nominations. It is just so insulting.
I heard you were kind of a leg man.
Well, it's part of my job to call attention to the obvious every now and then.
My goodness, look at those legs.
Thank you, sir.
That's a tremendous outfit. And the reason that's a tremendous outfit is you have tremendous legs.
But Letterman wasn't alone. Gawker put this highlight reel together in 2017. You do the math that was now 9 years ago. And some of the assurances and the accountability that were part of the headlines, that were part of the corporate sort of recognition, it's all gone. Or if it's still there, it's not nearly with the kind of teeth and the sort of transition that we had hoped. And so there's this feeling that we had coming out of the 80s, that the second wave feminists had in particular, that all the progress toward equality and the equity and the rights for everybody, they weren't making the same progress that the second wave feminists thought that they had made in the 70s and 80s. And so really what we're finding out through the Epstein files is that fashion and makeup and beauty standards were in fact governed by the very men who were involved with Epstein. And that changed the entire experience of how we lived. So the filters that have been applied to social norms and standards and our very lives, they were in fact clouded by a filter, the male gaze filter, a green, infected, ugly filter. So you're wondering, how does this all translate to TV? And I'll tell you, I did an examination of the sitcoms from 1990 to 2000, TV's sitcoms, ABC, NBC, CBS. Now, recognizing that if you kind of you do a layer or an overlay of when David Letterman's late night show was on, he ran from 1982 to 2015. So this is right smack in the middle of his immense popularity. Many of the women who were on the sitcoms that I'm about to talk about were in fact guests on his couch. and had to deal with him. That was part of their job, in addition to their actual job of performing. And they were supposed to like it, and they were supposed to dress a certain way. And while the subject matter might have been something, those women guests, before they even had a moment to open their mouths, he had disarmed them. He had determined what the nature of the conversation was going to be, and it was going to be about them and their looks and their social life. And in doing that, he projected to the audience that they did not need to be taken seriously. We weren't here to talk about the film. We weren't here to talk about somebody's first opportunity to direct anything that was about their profession. Oh, no, no, no. We were going to talk about their bodies and their sex life. And that also then set the standard for the other late night hosts, either the ones that he was competing with, such as Jay Leno, or Dick Cavett off in PBS land doing his thing, which he had actually been doing. He was salacious before Letterman ever got the first nod. And I think Joan Rivers, bless her heart, tried to be as ribald and sort of controversial as she could to make up for the fact that she wasn't going to ask those kinds of questions. That's in and of itself a fascinating concept that I haven't thought that much about. And it's hard to find Joan Rivers' late night show available because, of course, Johnny Carson shot it down. So let's go back to the late 80s, which now, when you look at it, was a golden age for, air quotes, strong women characters, leads in sitcoms. And you know what? They were created, those series were created by women, somewhat older women, if you want to call it, in their 40s. And the characters in these series were in their 30s and 40s and even older, because that golden age included Designing Women, which aired from 1983 to 1993. And it was created by and written, many, many episodes, written by Linda Bloodworth Thomason. Now, I've done a whole episode about Linda Bloodworth Thomason, as well as a couple episodes on Designing Women. Long story short, Linda was banished from the industry, probably with a hefty check and a non-disclosure agreement, by the head of CBS, Les Moonves. Evening Shade, Burt Reynolds, Elizabeth Ashley, very, very cheeky, crisp writing. That, too, was a Linda Bloodworth Thomason series, aired from 1990 to 1994. Murphy Brown, considered, a classic that nobody gets to see for reasons that everybody claims has to do with music rights. I believe that there's more to it than that. And it was created by Diane English, who also helped try to create the reboot that aired a few years ago and sort of fell on its face. So Murphy Brown aired 1988 to 1998. But it's pretty clear, if you are a Murphy Brown fan and have that memory, that the last few years were much more difficult. They had a turnover in staff. They needed to keep it fresh. The political nature of it all, Lily Tomlin, it was kind of a different show there toward the end. And lastly, The Golden Girls, which aired 1985 to 1992, created by Susan Harris, who also had done Soap and Empty Nest. Again, very smart writing, very progressive subject matter. You had a whole bunch of women who would happily perform a well-written script about pretty much any controversial topic. So some of those did trickle in from the 80s into the 90s. But let's walk through a timeline of the top 10 TV shows, of which some of them were sitcoms, more actually early in the 90s than toward the end, because television was changing. So remember that in order for a sitcom to be a success, it was important that where you were in the weeknight schedule remain as consistent as possible, because that was still when people actually sat down to watch TV at a certain time. If you got moved around, that was practically a death knell. And the other aspect was that over the course of time, budgetary considerations could have changed the impact of the quality of the writing, or whatever, and ultimately it's somebody else's decision whether or not to cancel it. Though good ratings obviously kept you a little more immune to that. So in 1990 to 1991, the top 10 TV series were, in fact, it was heavy on sitcoms. Roseanne, A Different World, The Cosby Show, Cheers, Murphy Brown, The Golden Girls, Designing Women. That's why we think of it as such a classic time for sitcoms. And that's why you still see so many of them today, because there were literally hundreds of episodes for some of those series. Then in 1992, we had just Roseanne and Home Improvement and Murphy Brown, Coach and Cheers. Okay. 1993 to 1994, Home Improvement, the introduction of Seinfeld, Roseanne, Grace Under Fire, Coach, Frasier, and Murphy Brown. And as I said, Murphy Brown toward the end of the run was not the same show. It was not as tightly knit. But you will notice, even by 93 and 94, that we are starting to see more of a blue-collar presence. And some of these ensemble shows literally only have one woman, whether that's Seinfeld or Frasier. In 94 and 95, the top 10 included Seinfeld, Home Improvement, Grace Under Fire, Friends, and Roseanne. Pretty much the same. These are, now classic series that had a very good run in the 90s. In 1995 to 96, Seinfeld, Friends, Caroline in the City, The Single Guy, which never has made it 30 years later onto TV, and Home Improvement. Okay, so now there's a new trend, and that is that apart from Caroline in the City, a lot more of a white man, straight white man, becoming the face of the show. 1996, Seinfeld, Suddenly Susan, starring Brooke Shields. Friends, The Naked Truth, which had a couple good seasons. A series called Fired Up, and again, The Single Guy and Home Improvement. A lot of experimenting going on, but experimenting more with putting a white man into the lead position. 1997, Seinfeld, Veronica's Closet, starring Kirstie Alley. Friends, Union Square, and Home Improvement. By the time we get to 1998 and 1999, you had Friends and Frasier and Veronica's Closet. And then this series that came from Marta Kaufman and Company, Jessie, which starred Christina Applegate. And that was much heralded. Christina Applegate by then was, had been coming out of Married with Children, and she was funny, and she had been in some films. And then lastly, Home Improvement. So that's as we near the last full season before the 2000s. By 1999 to 2000, only 2 sitcoms were in the top 10, and that was Friends and Frasier. And those were very strong, seasoned vehicles, helmed by, again, Marta Kaufman and Company, and Frasier was James Burrows and Glenn and Les Charles. Frasier as a spinoff of Cheers. Now, we know already from lots of episodes I've done in the past that by 2000, TV was changing a lot. And the 3 big broadcast networks, the legacy networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, they had not really risen to the challenge that had been presented by cable, and it was causing them a lot of economic distress. Cable TV could air things that the big networks couldn't because of the FCC considerations. And so you had original cable programming coming out both on the free stations like TBS and USA and those. And then you also had premium cable, which was HBO and Showtime. And HBO, you only have to look at Sex and the City to realize the kind of liberty that they were able to take both with language and subject matter to appeal to a distinct audience and pick off audience that had otherwise just relied on the 3 free channels. You also had people who were using their VCRs. VCRs in 2000 were commonplace still, and you could rack up a whole week's worth of TV shows whenever they aired, as long as you knew when they aired. And it, too, it changed the Nielsen ratings, and it changed how people accessed TV and their lack of interest in wanting to sit down on a Monday night. And then lastly, you had the emerging forces of these independent networks that were starting to make their ways somewhat via cable. Fox, UPN, the WB, whatever you want to call it, the CW, their impact, it requires kind of a deeper look at really what the impact was and the legacy that they left as we headed into the real 2000s, because money started to play even more of a factor, as did technology. So when you think back to all of those series I mentioned, Veronica's Closet and Jessie's, series that we can't even get a hold of anymore. They aren't even printed in DVD. Roseanne, ironically, starring Roseanne Barr, offered an incredibly progressive array of content, including a gay wedding, and birth control and abortion, because this was a series targeted at family matters, blue collar situation of really kind of economically having to scrape it together week after week. And to that end, Roseanne Barr sort of had a Lucille Ball, I Love Lucy sort of feel of the things that she would do for her work. There was a lot of progressive content there. But apart from Roseanne and Grace Under Fire was starring Brett Butler. Again, Brett Butler and Roseanne came up out of stand-up comedy. But otherwise, the themes were mostly of thin women who were living in the big city and struggling to get by. That was the message to women in the 90s and the 2000s, was that if you are alone, if you are not married, and perhaps you're living with friends, it's a struggle. It's a financial struggle. And let's have fun with what it is you will do to either save your money or to try to find a better paying job. Again, the showrunners were groups that, as we see now, continue to be very, very influential. The Bright, Kaufman, and Crane group, which was Friends and Veronica's Closet and Jesse, and the Carsey and Werner, which was Grace Under Fire, and lots of series affiliated with Bill Cosby. James Burrows and Glenn and Les Charles were Frasier and Cheers and many more. Larry David, who is considered, a comic genius, icon, showrunner, changed the face of TV with Seinfeld. And Julia Louis-Dreyfus, love her, thinks she's very clever, glad that she is doing so much that she's doing now. But the Elaine Bennis character was one of 5 regular characters, 20%, and they were all white. And then lastly, what we have is the class from the strong women series of the 80s. Those showrunners were Diane English and Linda Bloodworth Thomason and Susan Harris. And each one of them is almost inaccessible today. They have absolutely receded into anonymity. And why is that? Why is that? I wish there was an answer. Although Linda Bloodworth Thomason did provide some of an answer as to why she has left the spotlight when she did her big public letter to the world in The Hollywood Reporter, which is an episode that you will find in the show notes, because I was so fascinated and moved when I read it that I felt like it needed to be brought forth to all TV historians. So I've just talked about 1990 to 2000 and am doing so through the lens of 2026. And what do I see? What do I see has changed? Well, from the 80s, there is clearly a predisposition toward putting these women in either blue-collar or struggling situations. It was no longer Julia Sugarbaker or Murphy Brown being kind of at the top of her professional game. No, these were women who were needing the permission and needing the privilege that others could bestow on them. That's a very important power shift to recognize. The lead women, to some degree, when you think about Kirstie Alley and Veronica's Closet and Roseanne Barr and Brett Butler, they were all in the tabloids. Back when the National Enquirer was right there in the grocery aisle, you could guarantee one of them was on the cover about every other month at the very minimum. They were doing something outrageous, controversial, revolved. They had said something. Roseanne Barr did the national anthem at a baseball game. They were not guaranteed. Okay, when you are considered sort of unstable, then the networks can do an awful lot to control you, to control your power, your rising stature, and make your life perhaps a little miserable. Because maybe, at that time, maybe there was undiagnosed mental illness going on. Maybe mental health was not a priority in some of those scenarios. And in fact, then the networks just sort of took advantage of it. And we know now a little bit more about Kirstie Alley's, Roseanne Barr's, and Brett Butler's struggles through their TV time. And then lastly, in all of the series, even including Friends, there were fewer women in the ensemble casts. Friends being perhaps the most equal, and that they, the stars, all 6 of them, went a long way toward ensuring that there was parity in pay, because originally some were supposed to be making more than others, and they held their own on that. And I give the men of the Friends cast a lot of credit for recognizing that measure of fairness. They, of course, being Gen Xers. And what was the same? What can be said about the 80s or the 90s? And as we look at them, is there anything that's still the same? Well, yeah, I will say this. No, very few women of color, or if any, because when you look back on that entire list of all 10 years, there were no, other than The Cosby Show and A Different World. And technically, Bill Cosby was the showrunner of both. But A Different World elevated Debbie Allen, who is a sheer genius in many different ways and an incredible storyteller, and took all of the strength she could get from that situation to create pure gold. There were no women of color, and in many cases, not too many characters of color in all of those years. What was going on? What was being normalized? Because that really wasn't entirely what we saw in the 80s, and we thought we were getting better. But then you look at Living Single, which aired 1993 to 1998, but it wasn't on the big broadcast networks. It was on Fox. And Yvette Lee Bowser has gone on to create other great series. Kim Fields, Queen Latifah, Erica Alexander, and Kim Coles never really got their due because it was on Fox. And technically, as four single women living in New York, they preceded Sex and the City and they preceded Friends. Or you have Girlfriends, which was actually into the aughts, 2000 to 2008, that aired on UPN. Again, the series was created by Mara Brock Akil, who has gone on to create other hit series, Tracy Ellis Ross, Golden Brooks, Persia White, Jill Marie Jones. Good writing, lowish budget, and it's still available in syndication. And that's just a really great series and a really great cast that should have been on network TV. So in short, we've got Fox and UPN and the WB and the CW, and all you have to do is Google what series we're on, because a lot of the most diverse casting, those series were being aired on those. And it was good. It was good TV. It's still TV that we can see today. Should have had a higher investment from the networks, could have had a higher investment, could have brought on more writers, smarter writers, veteran writers. On the other hand, it perhaps created opportunity for writers at the start of their career who are now part of more progressive TV. I haven't done the research on that. It would be interesting to look at. But for the most part, the broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, did not necessarily see Fox and UPN and the WB and the CW as a competition. They could kind of just fluff them off, that these were upstarts that were aimed at younger, diverse audiences. They can have them. But while they were making that statement and losing the audiences, losing eyes, and in a very rapidly changing technologic field, they were economically struggling. They were too proud and too white to reveal that perhaps the times were changing. So I say to myself, am I a conspiracy theorist? Is this a conspiracy? Was it a conspiracy? Well, I guess no, because for the most part, it was standard operating procedure. It was white men making decisions about what got the green light, how they were budgeted, whether or not the series would return, whether or not the subject matter or the cast should change. And along the way, they got rid of a few of the most important transformational women showrunners from the 80s. There was no success to add on to. They were just gone. And there was no way that they could mentor other women in the field, or at least not publicly. And what we start to see is that the women leads or the supporting roles were fresh faces, which often meant that they were pulling in less money. It actually took the new networks to recognize that audiences appreciated and expected to be able to see themselves on TV. And that too changed TV. So, listeners, I look at this stuff and I like to see trends. I search for the truth. And when I can find truth and I can find pieces together that sort of make a trend, I feel like I need to share it with you. And I can do that because I'm coming to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I have nothing to lose. I don't even I don't do advertising on Advanced TV Herstory because I don't want to be beholden to anybody. So here we are in 2026, all waiting for whatever explosive revelations will come from the Epstein files. How will it change TV? And how will it change our memories, our context of how we thought things were in the 90s and the 2000s? Because I'm kind of guessing that it's only going to shed more light on the misogyny and the calculated exclusion, just the very nature of who these men were, that they didn't think that bullying or NDAs was anything but the norm. And in the end, all of that behavior changed the one shared American experience that we know of, that bonded America in a way that was incredibly progressive and positive and warm, and that was television, that we could all go to work the next morning or school and talk about what we saw. So the ABC, NBC, and CBS economic, the too big to fail, were they too big to fail? Well, yeah, they kind of thought they were, but they did. And cable ate their lunch. But it's kind of a bummer because at the time, we really thought that the networks had our best interest at heart, had our entertainment as a priority, and instead it was more about the money. So sorry that this is a bit of a bummer, but it's a pre-Epstein sort of look at perhaps what we might see unfold once the files are shared in reality and in full disclosure. This is why I podcast, listeners. As you know, I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. I cannot do this podcast month in, month out without the assistance of Mary Lou Morose, my audio editor, and Nivea Lopez, the video editor, who brings all of these pieces together and makes it to be a pleasant experience for your ears and eyes. Our little jingle is done by Jazzer. It's called Take Me Higher and can be found at freemusicarchive.org. Please, when you have a chance, go to tvherstory.com and sign up for my monthly newsletter. I promise your information will never be shared or sold. The Letterman audio from earlier in the episode came from Gawker and the YouTube channel for Gawker. You will find the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening. Drive carefully. Stay hydrated.